Harrison Blackstone stood on the 35th floor of his Manhattan headquarters, surveying the urban landscape that had made him one of America's most powerful real estate developers. At 62, he controlled a commercial empire worth $3 billion, built through decades of strategic acquisitions and ruthless business decisions that prioritize profit above all other considerations. The latest addition to his portfolio was a full city block in Brooklyn's rapidly gentrifying Williamsburg neighborhood, purchased through a complex series of transactions that had taken 18 months to complete. The centerpiece of this acquisition was St. Mary's Community Church, a modest brick building that had served the local community for over a century, but now stood directly in the path of Harrison's most ambitious project yet. Harrison's development plan called for a 40-story luxury residential tower, with ground-floor commercial space, targeting wealthy professionals seeking trendy Brooklyn addresses with Manhattan skyline view. Market analysis projected profits exceeding $200 million, making it one of the most lucrative projects in his company's history. The only obstacle was the small church that occupied the exact center of his planned construction site. St. Mary's had been the final holdout among the block's property, refusing multiple purchase offers that had grown increasingly generous over the past year. The congregation, led by Pastor Williams, had argued that the church served as a vital community anchor for low-income families who had lived in the neighborhood for generations, providing services that would be impossible to replace if the building were demolished. Harrison had eventually succeeded in acquiring the church property through legal maneuvering that exploited the congregation's financial vulnerability. Mounting maintenance costs for the aging building, combined with declining attendance due to neighborhood demographic changes, had left the church unable to meet its obligations. Harrison's lawyers had negotiated a purchase agreement that satisfied the church's debts, while giving him complete control over the property and its immediate demolition. Chapter 2. The Demolition Order. Harrison's project manager, David Chen, received explicit instructions to begin demolition of St. Mary's Church immediately after the legal transfer of ownership was completed. Harrison emphasized that time was critical. Construction needed to begin before the end of the fiscal year to take advantage of specific tax incentives that would expire, potentially costing the project millions in additional expenses. The demolition contract was awarded to Bronson Construction, a company Harrison had used for similar projects requiring speed and efficiency over preservation. Their equipment and crew would arrive Monday morning to begin systematic dismantling of the church structure, starting with removal of any valuable materials that could be salvaged and sold, followed by complete destruction of the remaining building. Harrison instructed his team to handle any community resistance with firm but professional responses. Previous demolition projects had occasionally attracted protesters or activists concerned about neighborhood character, but Harrison's experience suggested that opposition usually diminished quickly once demolition actually began, and residents realized the inevitability of change. Legal notices had been posted as required by city ordinances, informing the community about the planned demolition and construction timeline. Harrison's public relations firm had prepared standard responses, emphasizing the economic benefits the new development would bring to the neighborhood. Construction jobs, increased tax revenue, and improved property values that would benefit existing homeowners. St. Mary's final service had been held the previous Sunday, with Pastor Williams conducting an emotional farewell ceremony for congregation members who had worshipped in the building for decades. Many parishioners wept as they said goodbye to a space that had hosted their weddings, baptisms, and funerals, understanding that their community's spiritual center was disappearing forever to make room for luxury housing they could never afford. Chapter 3. The First Encounter. On Monday morning, Harrison arrived at the demolition site to personally oversee the beginning of destruction, wanting to ensure the project stayed on schedule and within budget. Bronson Construction's crew had positioned their equipment around the church building, with a massive excavator ready to begin breaking down the exterior walls once the final paperwork was completed and safety protocols were established. As Harrison reviewed demolition plans with the construction foreman, he noticed a small group of children gathered on the sidewalk across the street from the church. They appeared to range in age from about 6 to 12 years old, dressed in clothing that suggested they came from families with limited financial resources. Some carried backpacks, indicating they might be on their way to school, but their attention was focused intently on the church building. Harrison initially dismissed the children as neighborhood residents curious about the construction activity, a common occurrence during major development projects. Urban children were naturally drawn to heavy machinery and demolition work, and Harrison assumed they would lose interest and move along once classes began at the local elementary school. However, as the morning progressed, the group of children remained stationary across from the church. Their number had grown to approximately 15, with some appearing to be siblings or friends who had been called to join the gathering. They stood quietly, not playing or talking loudly as children typically would, but maintaining a solemn vigil that puzzled Harrison and began to attract attention from other neighborhood residents. When Harrison approached David Chen to inquire about the children, his project manager explained that they had been there since before sunrise, apparently arriving individually but gathering in a coordinated. Some carried small items that looked like flowers or candles, suggesting their presence might be related to some kind of memorial or tribute activity that Harrison's team had not anticipated. Chapter 4. The Unexpected Hymn. As the demolition crew completed their final safety checks and prepared to begin destruction of the church building, something extraordinary happened that stopped Harrison and everyone else at the construction site. The group of children across the street began singing in unison, their young voices carrying clearly across the morning air with a hymn that many of the older residents immediately recognized. The children sang "Amazing Grace" with remarkable harmony and emotional depth that seemed impossible from such young performers. Their voices blended together in perfect pitch, creating a sound that was both beautiful and haunting as it echoed off the surrounding building. Passers-by stopped walking, construction workers paused their preparations, and an unexpected silence fell over the busy street. Harrison felt an uncomfortable stirring in his chest as the children's voices reached him. The hymn was one he remembered from his own childhood, when his grandmother had taken him to Sunday services at a small country church in rural Georgia. Those memories, buried under decades of corporate success and urban sophistication, suddenly surfaced with surprising emotional intensity. The construction foreman approached Harrison to ask whether they should proceed with demolition while the children were singing, uncertain about the appropriate protocol for such an unusual situation. Harrison found himself hesitating, unable to give the order to begin destruction, while those pure young voices filled the air with a song that spoke of redemption, grace, and spiritual transformation. As the first hymn ended, the children immediately began another, "How Great Thou Art," with the same perfect harmony and emotional conviction. More neighborhood residents had gathered on sidewalks and in doorways, drawn by the beautiful music and the poignant contrast between the children's spiritual offering and the impending destruction of their community's sacred space. Chapter 5. The Growing Congregation. Word about the children's hymn singing spread rapidly through the neighborhood, transmitted by social media, text messages, and old-fashioned word of mouth. By mid-morning, what had begun as a small group of 15 children had grown into an impromptu congregation of nearly 50 people, including parents, grandparents, and other community members who felt compelled to join the peaceful vigil. Pastor Williams arrived at the scene, having heard about the children's gathering from multiple parishioners, who called him with updates about the situation. He stood with the growing crowd, his eyes filled with tears, as he watched young people from his community demonstrate their attachment to the church building through the universal language of sacred music. The children continued their repertoire of hymns with "Blessed Assurance," "In the Sweet By and By," and other traditional songs that resonated with the spiritual heritage of the African American that had long called this neighborhood home. Their voices never wavered, their harmony never faltered, and their commitment to the vigil never diminished despite the early morning hour and school day responsibility. Harrison observed the growing gathering with increasing discomfort, recognizing that his straightforward demolition project was becoming complicated by community emotions he had not anticipated or planned for. The sight of children expressing such profound connection to a building he viewed purely as an economic obstacle challenged his assumptions about the church's actual value to neighborhood residents. Local news reporters began arriving at the scene, alerted by community members who recognized the symbolic power of children singing hymns in front of a church scheduled for demolition. Television crews positioned themselves to capture both the children's performance and the demolition equipment waiting nearby, creating a visual narrative that immediately communicated the tension between community values and commercial development. Chapter 6. The Media Attention. Within hours, footage of the children singing hymns outside the condemned church began appearing on local television news broadcasts and social media platforms. The story's emotional impact was immediate and widespread, with viewers expressing outrage about a wealthy developer destroying a community church, despite opposition from neighborhood children who clearly treasured the building. Harrison's public relations team fielded dozens of calls from journalists seeking comment about the development project and the community resistance it was generating. The narrative emerging in media coverage was not favorable to Harrison or his company. Wealthy businessman destroying historic church over the objections of poor children struck many observers as a modern David and Goliath story with clear moral implications. The children's vigil attracted solidarity from other community organizations, including local schools, social service agencies, and advocacy groups concerned about gentrification's impact on longtime neighborhood residents. By afternoon, the gathering had grown to include several hundred people, with participants arriving from across Brooklyn and even Manhattan to show support for the children and opposition to the demolition. Harrison found himself facing a public relations nightmare that threatened to damage his company's reputation and potentially impact other projects in his development pipeline. Corporate clients, investors, and political allies who had previously supported his projects were now calling to express concerns about being associated with someone perceived as destroying community institutions for profit. The story gained national attention when it was picked up by major news networks and social media influencers who shared videos of the children singing with millions of followers. Comment sections filled with praise for the children's courage and criticism of Harrison's demolition plan, creating a viral moment that positioned his development project as a symbol of corporate greed versus community values. Chapter 7. The Personal Revelation. That evening, Harrison sat alone in his penthouse apartment, unable to concentrate on business documents as the children's voices echoed in his memory. The hymns they had sung with such conviction were songs he had not heard in 40 years. Melodies that transported him back to a time when his life had very different priorities, and his understanding of success was measured by different standards. Harrison's grandmother, Sarah Blackstone, had been a devout woman who believed deeply in the power of faith to transform lives and communities. She had taught him those same hymns during long summer visits to her small town in Georgia, where the local church served as the center of social, spiritual, and cultural life for African American families who had few other sources of community support. Sarah had often told young Harrison that wealth and success were gifts that came with responsibilities to help others, especially those with fewer advantages and opportunities. She had worked as a domestic servant for wealthy families while raising 5 children alone, but she had never expressed bitterness about inequality or resentment toward those who had more than she did. Harrison realized that somewhere in his pursuit of business success, he had abandoned the values his grandmother had tried to instill in him. His focus on profit maximization and competitive advantage had gradually eroded his connection to the moral principles that had guided his. The sight of children defending their community church with nothing but their voices and faith had awakened something in him that had been dormant for decades. The uncomfortable truth dawning on Harrison was that his demolition of St. Mary's Church was not just a real estate transaction, but an attack on the kind of community institution that had sustained people like his grandmother through decades of hardship and discrimination. The children singing hymns were protecting something he had once valued, but had learned to dismiss as irrelevant to modern success. Chapter 8. The Sleepless Night. Harrison spent the night walking through his luxury apartment, unable to sleep as he grappled with emotions and memories he had suppressed for years. The contrast between his current lifestyle and the humble values his grandmother had represented created an internal conflict that was impossible to ignore or rationalize away. He found himself looking through old photo albums he rarely opened, studying pictures of Sarah Blackstone in her church club, surrounded by family members and community friends who had found joy and meaning in simple gatherings and shared faith. The church building in those photographs looked remarkably similar to St. Mary's, modest, unpretentious, but clearly beloved by the people who called it their spiritual. Harrison's successful career had been built on the ability to see properties as numbers on financial statements, rather than as places where real people lived, worked, and worshipped. This analytical approach had made him wealthy, but had also disconnected him from the human stories attached to every building he acquired and demolished or renovated. The children's hymn singing had shattered his emotional detachment, forcing him to confront the reality that St. Mary's Church was not just an obstacle to his development project, but a vital institution that provided spiritual sustenance, community connection, and cultural continuity for families who had few other sources of stability in their lives. As dawn approached, Harrison made a decision that would have seemed impossible 24 hours earlier. He called David Chen and instructed him to halt all demolition preparations immediately, postponing the destruction of St. Mary's Church indefinitely while Harrison reconsidered the entire development. The decision could cost him millions in delayed construction and lost tax incentives, but Harrison felt compelled to explore alternatives he had never previously considered. Chapter 9. The Community Meeting. Harrison's announcement that he was postponing the church demolition created confusion among his construction crew, legal team, and investors, but it generated hope and celebration in the surrounding community. Word spread quickly that the children's hymn vigil had achieved something many residents had thought impossible, stopping a powerful developer's demolition plans through the sheer moral force of their peaceful protest. Pastor Williams organized a community meeting at a nearby school to discuss the situation and explore possibilities for preserving St. Mary's Church while accommodating Harrison's development interests. The meeting drew over 200 residents, including many who had not been regular churchgoers but recognized the building's importance as a community anchor and symbol of neighborhood identity. Harrison surprised everyone by attending the community meeting personally. Accompanied only by David Chen, and without the team of lawyers and public relations specialists who typically handled his community interactions. His presence created a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and hope among residents who had viewed him as an adversary but were willing to engage in dialogue if he was genuinely interested in finding compromise solutions. The meeting began with presentations from community members about the church's history and its role in neighborhood life. Elderly residents shared stories about weddings, baptisms, funerals, and community celebrations that had taken place in the building over several decades. Parents described after-school programs, food pantry services, and emergency assistance that the church provided to families struggling with poverty and other challenges. The children who had led the hymn vigil were invited to speak about why the church was important to them. Their testimonies were simple but powerful, describing the building as a place where they felt safe, loved, and connected to something larger than themselves. They spoke about learning to sing in the church choir, participating in youth programs, and finding comfort during difficult times in their families or neighborhood. Chapter 10. The Proposal. After listening to community presentations about the church's importance, Harrison surprised the meeting attendees by outlining a completely revised development proposal that would preserve St. Mary's Church while still achieving his project's financial objectives. His new plan called for constructing the luxury residential tower on the portion of the block that did not include the church, while creating a community partnership that would ensure the church's long-term survival and enhanced services. Harrison proposed establishing a community foundation funded by profits from the residential development, with the foundation purchasing the church property from his company and providing ongoing financial support for building maintenance, program expansion, and pastor salary. The arrangement would give the congregation permanent ownership of their building, while relieving them of the financial pressures that had made the original sale necessary. The revised development plan also included community benefits that had not been part of Harrison's original proposal: affordable housing units within the luxury tower, local hiring preferences for construction jobs, small business support for neighborhood entrepreneurs, and public space improvements that would benefit existing residents rather than only incoming gentrifiers. Harrison acknowledged that his original approach had been narrow and insensitive to community needs, and he committed to ongoing consultation with neighborhood leaders throughout the development process. He proposed creating a community advisory board with real decision-making authority over aspects of the project that would impact longtime residents. The community responded to Harrison's proposal with cautious optimism, recognizing that his revised plan addressed many of their concerns while providing resources to strengthen rather than destroy existing community institutions. However, many residents expressed skepticism about whether Harrison's conversion was genuine or simply a public relations strategy to manage the negative media attention his original demolition plan had generated. Chapter 11. The transformation begins. Over the following weeks, Harrison demonstrated his commitment to the revised development and through concrete actions that convinced skeptical community members of his sincerity. He established the Community Foundation with an initial endowment of $10 million, hired local residents for preliminary construction work, and began weekly meetings with Pastor Williams and other neighborhood leaders to ensure ongoing collaboration. The children who had initiated the hymn vigil became unofficial ambassadors for the new partnership, with Harrison regularly consulting them about community needs and preferences. Their honest perspectives and innocent questions challenged Harrison to consider aspects of the development that his business training had not prepared him to address. Harrison also began attending Sunday services at St. Mary's Church, initially as an observer but gradually becoming a participant in the spiritual community he had nearly destroyed. Pastor Williams welcomed him with the same grace he extended to all congregation members, understanding that Harrison's transformation was still developing and required patience and support rather than judgment. The experience of regular worship and community involvement introduced Harrison to a different definition of success than the purely financial metrics that had previously guided his decisions. He began to understand that sustainable development required considering social and spiritual impacts alongside economic return, and that true leadership meant serving community needs, rather than simply maximizing personal profit. Local media coverage of Harrison's transformation and the successful community partnership generated positive attention that enhanced his company's reputation and attracted new clients interested in socially responsible development projects. Harrison discovered that ethical business practices were not only morally satisfying, but also financially viable in an era when consumers and investors increasingly valued corporate social responsibility. Chapter 12. The Dedication Ceremony. 9 months after the children's hymn vigil had stopped the demolition, Harrison and the community celebrated the dedication of both the preserved St. Mary's Church and the completed luxury residential tower that had been redesigned to complement rather than overshadow the historic building. The ceremony brought together congregation members, new tower residents, local officials, and media representatives who had followed the project's evolution. The celebration began with a service of thanksgiving at St. Mary's Church, where the same children who had sung hymns to protest the demolition now performed to celebrate the building's preservation and renovation. Harrison had funded comprehensive restoration of the church's interior and exterior, bringing the building to better condition than it had enjoyed in decades while preserving all its historic character and community significance. Pastor Williams delivered a sermon about redemption, transformation, and the power of community action to change hearts and circumstances. He spoke directly about Harrison's journey from potential destroyer to community partner, emphasizing that change was possible for anyone willing to listen to their conscience and respond to calls for justice and compassion. The residential tower, completed on schedule despite the design modifications, had attracted tenants who were drawn not only by the luxury amenities, but by the opportunity to live in a development that strengthened rather than displaced existing community. The building's affordable housing units were occupied by neighborhood families, creating economic diversity that enriched the community for all residents. Harrison announced during the dedication ceremony that he was expanding the community partnership model to other development projects, establishing a new division of his company focused exclusively on socially responsible real estate development. The success of the St. Mary's project had demonstrated that profitable development and community benefit were not mutually exclusive, but could be mutually reinforcing when approached with creativity and commitment. Chapter 13. The Lasting Legacy. 2 years after the Children's Hymn Vigil, St. Mary's Church had become a model for community-centered development that attracted visitors from across the country interested in learning about successful partnerships between private developers and neighborhood institutions. Harrison regularly spoke at conferences about his transformation and the business case for socially responsible development practices. The children who had initiated the protest through their courageous hymn singing had grown into young leaders within their community, with several receiving college scholarships funded by Harrison's foundation. Their action had taught them about the power of peaceful resistance and moral conviction to create change even when confronting overwhelming odds and powerful opponents. Harrison's relationship with the St. Mary's community had evolved into genuine friendship and mutual respect, with his regular participation in church activities and community events reflecting authentic commitment rather than public relations strategy. His grandmother's values, reawakened by the children's spiritual witness, now guided both his personal life and business decisions. The success of the community partnership had generated additional investment in the neighborhood, but the presence of the preserved church and active community foundation ensured that development benefits reached longtime residents rather than displacing them. The area had become more prosperous while maintaining its cultural identity and social cohesion. Harrison often reflected on how close he had come to making a decision that would have enriched him financially while impoverishing himself spiritually and morally. The Children's Hymn Vigil had saved not only their church, but his own soul, demonstrating that moral courage could triumph over economic power when guided by faith, community solidarity, and the timeless truth that some things were more valuable than money. The story of St. Mary's Church became a symbol of hope for communities facing similar threats from gentrification and development pressure, proving that ordinary people, even children, could effect extraordinary change when they acted with courage, conviction, and the support of their. Harrison's transformation showed that even the most hardened business leaders could rediscover their humanity when confronted with the moral clarity of those they had overlooked or underestimated. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of redemption, community courage, and the triumph of moral conviction over material greed. The story of Harrison and the children of St. Mary's reminds us that change is always possible, that the voices of the innocent can move mountains, and that true success is measured not in dollars accumulated, but in lives touched and communities strengthened. We're grateful you took the time to experience this tale of transformation with us. Please share in the comments where you're listening from around the world. We love connecting with our global community and hearing how these stories of hope and human dignity resonate with people from all walks of life.